Bernini and Borghese. Rarely in the history of art has a patron-artist relationship been as fruitful as that enjoyed by the young Gian Lorenzo Bernini and the powerful Cardinal. Scipione Borghese, Bernini was one of those figures in history who seemed to be born for greatness, destined to become the most famous sculptor of his generation and to forge the urban landscape of Baroque Rome in his own image. It was at the palatial suburban villa of Scipione Borghese that the young artist first found fame. PLUTO and Persephone, 1621. The next large-scale mythological work that Bernini produced for Scipione marked a quantum leap in his development as a sculptor. In the PLUTO and Persephone, created between 1621 and 1622, the young sculptor pushes the material limitations of marble to breaking point and beyond, working the unyielding stone as easily as if it were the most elastic dough. The ensemble also magnificently showcases Bernini's developing ability to transform complex narratives into sculptural groups capable of telling entire stories in a single moment. This extraordinary sculpture in the round tells the disturbing tale of Pluto, the dread god of the underworld, and the doomed Persephone, whose fates are locked in a dark tale of violence, lust, and abduction. Chancing to Aspi Persephone, the attractive daughter of the goddess of agriculture Demeter, cavorting in a meadow, the emerald Pluto determines to forcibly make her his wife at all costs. Bernini takes up the drama after the god of the underworld has swept up the young Persephone in his meaty arms, already striding purposefully towards his subterranean kingdom as his victim struggles uselessly in his divine grip. Persephone pushes futilely against the bemused god's greedily lustful face as an unseen wind whips her hair, her visage a horrifying portrait of terror and despair. In one of the great virtuoso details of sculptural history, Pluto's thick fingers sink into Persephone's thigh, stony marble transformed into yielding flesh through Bernini's preternatural skill. Only a trip around the entirety of the sculpture reveals the full gravity of the moment. Revealed at Pluto's feet is the three-headed dog Cerberus, guardian of the underworld. Persephone has just been carried over the threshold of Hades, and there is no going back. Her fate is sealed as unwilling goddess of Death's kingdom. But as the myth goes, there was at least some light at the end of the tunnel for the brutally abducted Persephone. Thanks to the imprecations of her mother, who refused to let crops bear fruit until she received justice, Persephone was allowed to return to the land of the living each spring, heralding the growth and new life of the season. Persephone's annual force to return to Hades, by contrast, marked the beginning of winter, a moment forever immortalized in Bernini's majestic marble. Sleeping Hermaphrodites, Roman art. The work is a combination of an archaeological hermaphrodite with a mattress made in 1774 by the sculptor Andrea Burgundy. The figure, Nude and supine, is caught in a moment of intimate repose, with a slight twist of the torso in relation to the raised pelvis, suggesting movement in sleep. This creates two sides of vision, one where the viewer observes the hips, sinuous buttocks, and face, and a second, opposite, in which the dual nature, male and female, is revealed. The Borghese sculpture is to be considered a reworking from the Roman period, dating back to the 2nd century AD, inspired by an original from the Hellenistic period. Pliny the Elder attributes a statue of Hermaphroditus to the Greek sculptor Polycles, who probably worked in the 2nd century BC. La VERITA by Gian Lorenzo Bernini. Why is the La VERITA piece so important? Because it was created during a very difficult period in his career, which ended with the demolition of one of the bell towers he designed for St. Peter's Basilica. The sculpture of Truth is depicted as a smiling, naked girl sitting on a rock, holding the sun in her right hand and resting her left leg on the globe. The work is part of a sculptural group that would represent the allegory of truth revealed by time, which was never completed. When the artist died, his heirs sold the large marble sculpture. Mariano Rossi Hall. Imposing because of its size, the sumptuousness of its decoration, and the monumental sculptures it hosts, the hall ushers the visitor onto the itinerary through the museum. The dominant feature is the ceiling by Mariano Rossi, 1731-1807, executed between 1775 and 1779 as part of the renovation of the building commissioned by Prince Marcantonio Borghese IV and directed by the architect Antonio. Asprucci, 1723-1808. The subject celebrates Roman civilization and the heroic virtue of honor. In the center is the depiction of Romulus, welcomed to Olympus by Jupiter to propitiate the victory of furious Camillus against Brennus, king of the Gauls. The choice of the subject is also connected with the birth, on the 8th of August 1775, of Marcantonio IV's first son, Camilla, who was to marry Pauline, Napoleon's sister. Portrayed around the main motif are justice, loyalty, and honor, which triumph thanks to the action of time over the vices, slander, deceit, and falseness. The fame of Rome and its victories alluded to by the episodes on the margins of the long side of the ceiling. The decorations of the walls with painted floral and animal motifs and the stucco cameos were executed by a large team of artists, including Vincenzo Pisetti, 1746-1820, Massimiliano Laborer, 1767-1831, and Tommaso Ricci, 1727-1802. At the time of Cardinal Scipione Borghese, 1577-1633, who commissioned the villa, the group with Marcus Curtius leaping into the chasm in the Forum to save the Roman people, consisting of an ancient horse, 2nd century CE, and a rider, by Pietro Bernini, 1618, was outside the building on the facade facing Porta Pisciana. In 1776, however, the architect Antonio Asprucci had it moved to high up on the wall across from the entrance. AENEAS, ANCHISES, and ASCANIUS fleeing Troy, 1619. A teetering, twisting tangle of bodies. The precarious Aeneas fleeing Troy is the first major work that Bernini would produce for the all-powerful Cardinal Borghese. The story comes from Virgil's Roman epic, the Aeneid, a tale that loomed large in the mythology of the Eternal City, according to ancient Roman mythology. As the hero Aeneas fled his native Troy at the denouement of the Trojan Wars, the winds of fate took him towards Italian shores, where he eventually founded Rome. The subject had a noble tradition in Italian art, with Raphael famously anachronistically depicting it in his Vatican fresco The Fire in the Borgo. Bernini's Aeneas is young and handsome, bearing a striking resemblance to Michelangelo's Risen Christ in Santa Maria sopra Minerva. In tow is his aging father, Anchises, clad in a rustic buncher, whom our young hero carries to safety on his sturdy shoulders, and his son Ascanius, who totters on dutifully behind. The composition at first seems somewhat awkward, its towering serpentine form a not wholly successful take on G.M. Bologna's masterful rape of the Sabine in Florence. The splendid Venus Victrix. We are all familiar with the exploits of Napoleon Bonaparte, one of the most important figures in European history, but who was his sister Pauline? If you want to put a face to her, follow your tour of the Borghese Gallery, which exhibits the young Pauline Bonaparte transformed into a radiant goddess Venus through a mythologized portrait, which reminds me of Goya's The Naked Maja, but in a sculpture version. What is so special about this work? The surprising thing about this piece is that to get it, Pauline Bonaparte posed as God brought her into the world for the masterpiece by the Italian neoclassical sculptor Antonio Canova. The sculpture arrived in the garden in 1838 and, according to legend, caused such a stir that there were queues at night to see the statue of the naked girl, one of the most beautiful and modern women of her time. Antonio Canova, the 1st of November 1757, the 13th of October 1822, was an Italian neoclassical sculptor, famous for his marble sculptures. Often regarded as the greatest of the neoclassical artists, his sculpture was inspired by the Baroque and the Classical Revival, and has been characterized as having avoided the melodramatics of the former and the cold artificiality of the latter. An example for subsequent Egyptian rooms in Roman mansions. This room was expressly conceived between 1779 and 1782 dabi the architect Antonio Asprucci, 1723-1808, to house the Egyptian statues in the collection. The Nile River with its children, the beneficial floods, and the goddess Cybele is depicted in the center of the ceiling. All around the large painting by Tommaso Maria Conca, 1734-1822, in the architectural trompe-l'oeils by Giovanni Battista Marchetti, 1730-1800. Apollo and Daphne, 1622. It must have seemed to his contemporaries that Bernini had reached a level of perfection in the transformation of ancient mythological narrative into sculpture, with Pluto and Persephone that would be impossible to match. And yet the young master was just getting started. Delighted as he was with the Pluto group, Cardinal Borghese decided to make a politically astute gift of it to the new Pope's nephew, Bernini's bosom buddy Ludovico Ludovisi. The sculpture was only returned to the Villa Borghese in 1908. Scipione was convinced, it seems, that Bernini could go one better. To replace the sculpture he had given away, Borghese commissioned Bernini to produce another mythological group, this time depicting the tale of Apollo and Daphne, recounted in Ovid's Metamorphoses. The myth tells how spiteful Cupid pierced Apollo with one of his arrows, making the god fall in love with the beautiful nymph Daphne. At the same time, he pierced Daphne with an arrow, causing her to detest the love-stricken Apollo, setting in motion a doomed dance of desire and repulsion. Bernini once again takes up the action at its crucial moment. Apollo, whose features are inspired by the Apollo Belvedere in the Vatican, young, handsome, and clad only in a light cloak swirling about his body, is pursuing Daphne through the woods, their marble forms a whirl of speed and movement. So ran the god and girl. Ovid writes, one swift in hope, the other in terror. The nymph is fleet of foot, but no match for the god born on the wings of love. Daphne feels her pursuer gaining ground, shadowing her shoulder, breathing on her streaming hair. As we gaze on, we can almost feel the god's hot breath on Daphne's extraordinarily sculpted tresses. Desperate, Daphne implores her father, a river god, to save her from her fate. Oh, help me. If there is any power in the rivers, change and destroy this body that has given too much delight. David, 1623. If the precocious Bernini was consciously taking on the challenge of Raphael in his earlier AENEAS group, the final epic narrative sculpture that he produced for Scipione Borghese saw him aiming his sights even higher in his attempt to fashion a place for himself, in the top tier of Italian artists. The figure of the biblical David slaying the seemingly immortal Goliath had already produced two of the greatest masterpieces ever essayed in sculpture. Michelangelo's iconic hero contemplating the task ahead, and Donatello's triumphant, delicate youth resting on the giant's freshly severed head. In contrast to Michelangelo's aloof hero or Donatello's slouch and charming youth, Bernini's David is a solid, no-nonsense figure. Unlike the earlier AENEAS, David is far from a generic imitation of an earlier prototype and exudes individual personality. His furrowed brows bristle with intensity of purpose, and he bites his upper lip in fierce concentration. Whilst Donatello and Michelangelo went for the moments preceding and succeeding the fight, Bernini went for the dramatic jugular. According to Giovanni Pietro Bellori, this artwork was executed for Scipione Borghese, and Goliath's head was, in reality, Caravaggio's self-portrait. Moreover, a document of 1613 connected to the payment for the frame of work having similar sizes. A self-portrait of Caravaggio. He poses as the Roman god Bacchus, the god of grape harvest, wine, and intoxication.